This presentation is about what data can tell us about gender-based violence in the context of universities and other research organizations. But first, I want us to remember that when we talk about data, these are not just numbers. They're actual people and incidents. I sincerely hope that the work that we do in measuring gender-based violence and disseminating that knowledge contributes to addressing gender-based violence. My name is Anne Laure Humbert, and I am a researcher at Oxford Brookes University in the UK, with a long-standing interest in measuring gender inequalities in society and the economy, which I see at the root cause of gender-based violence. My aim today is to share with you some key findings from the UniSAFE survey to allow us to better understand, and therefore how to better address the problem of gender-based violence in universities and other research organizations. We examine different forms of gender-based violence in the UniSAFE project. We start from the four main forms of gender-based violence outlined by the Council of Europe, which are also the main one considered by the European Commission. That is physical, sexual, psychological, and economic violence. We also add sexual harassment, which is of great relevance to the context of universities and to the wider world of work, and is increasingly considered now, such as, for example, the International Labour Organization. Finally, given how new technologies have created new modalities of harm, we also examine online violence. However, it's also very important to remember that all forms of gender-based violence are interrelated. This means, for example, in institutions where there is comparatively more sexual harassment, there may also tend to be more incidents of sexual violence, of physical violence, economic violence, psychological violence, and online violence. The survey was designed to provide empirical evidence for each of the 7 Ps in the model used in the UniSAFE project. The objective is to analyze the prevalence of gender-based violence in relation to its determinant and its consequences, as well as respond to prevention, protection, prosecution, the provision of services, partnerships, and policy. The project has carried out what we believe is the largest cross-cultural survey in Europe in the research sector on gender-based violence. We collected over 42,000 responses from staff and students across 46 research performing organizations in 15 countries. The survey was translated in 14 languages, and the field time ran from the 17th of January to the 1st of May 2022. Of the 42,186 respondents to the survey, which were all aged 18 or above, 43% were staff and 57% were students. 67% of respondents identified as women, 30% as men, and 3% as non-binary or another gender identity. 19% identified as LGBTQ+, 6% as a member of an ethnic minority group, and 11% had a disability or chronic illness. So first, what do we know about the prevalence of gender-based violence in universities and other research organizations from the UniSAFE survey? The UniSAFE survey results show the scale of the problem. Nearly 2 in 3 of the survey respondents, that is 62%, report having experienced at least one form of gender-based violence in the context of their work or studies. 57% report having experienced at least one incident of psychological violence. Nearly 1 in 3 report at least one incident of sexual harassment. And finally, 3% report having experienced at least one incident of sexual violence. Focusing on numbers of individuals rather than prevalence rates, our results show, for example, that there are approximately 12,000 respondents saying that they had experienced sexual harassment. For sexual violence, this concerns nearly 1,000 of our respondents. It is worth remembering that even one single incident of gender-based violence is too much. Looking at prevalence by gender identity confirms that women are disproportionately affected compared with men. However, the gender identity group that is most affected are people that identify as non-binary or another gender identity. Looking at prevalence alone is not sufficient. And it's also important to look at the frequency of gender-based violence. The UniSAFE survey asks follow-up questions when respondents report having experienced an incident. For incidents related to sexual violence or physical violence, the majority happen only once. But in contrast, incidents related to sexual harassment or psychological violence are more likely to be repeated. In the UniSAFE survey, we also look at who the perpetrators are perceived to be. The victim-perpetrator relationship can be looked at through dyads, which consist of violence from one or more persons from one group towards one or more persons from one group. The main dyads are violence that comes from staff towards staff or from student towards student. It can also be from staff towards students or students towards staff. But we can also have violence from another person in the context of the institution towards staff or towards students. And of course, there are many other possible configurations. The UniSAFE survey shows that typically staff face violence from colleagues and other co-workers or their superiors. For students, perpetrators are more likely to be other students and acquaintances associated with the institution, though there are some incidents that involved largely teaching staff. The UniSAFE survey also asked about the perceived gender of perpetrators in its follow-up questions. For all forms of gender-based violence, the majority of perpetrators are perceived as one or more men. In the case of sexual violence and sexual harassment, the perpetrators are identified as one or more men for 78% of incidents. Breaking this data down by the gender identity of the respondents shows strong differences related to how the gender of the victim and the gender of the perpetrator interact across different forms of gender-based violence. For example, for women respondents who have experienced sexual violence or sexual harassment, the perpetrator is identified as one or more men in 97% and 91% of cases, respectively. It's also very important for us not to only measure the prevalence of gender-based violence, but also its consequences. Among staff, those who have experienced gender-based violence are more likely to suffer adverse consequences at work. In particular, they are much more likely to feel dissatisfied with their job, to experience reduced work productivity, or even to consider leaving the academic sector altogether. The same pattern applies to students. For example, students who have experienced gender-based violence are much more likely to feel dissatisfied with the course of their studies, to experience reduced learning achievements, or to consider opting out of university altogether. Despite the widespread prevalence of gender-based violence and its severity, few incidents are reported to institution, and this is something we also examined in the UniSAFE survey. Only 12.5% reported an incidence of gender-based violence they disclosed in the UniSAFE survey. In addition, we found that students were much less likely to report than staff, with 7% for students compared to 23% of incidents reported for staff. The reasons given for not reported include the following: being unsure if the behavior was serious enough to report, not recognizing the behavior as violence at the time, not thinking anything would happen if it was reported, or not knowing who to tell. Not reporting is related to the institutional context in which gender-based violence takes place, including how confident respondents felt in the response of their institutions when reporting an incident. Respondents who have experienced gender-based violence are much less likely to feel confident in their institution's ability to deal with gender-based violence. 55% of them are either not at all confident or not very confident, compared to 28% for those that have not experienced gender-based violence. On the whole, the majority of respondents agree or strongly agree that their institutions would offer protection or provide services to someone making a formal report. However, this is markedly lower among respondents who experience gender-based violence. They are, for example, less likely to agree or strongly agree that their institutions would believe the person making the report, would support them, would take steps to protect the person, or would take action to remedy the factors that may have led to the reported incident. In addition to the survey, the UniSAFE project has generated knowledge from a national and institutional mapping of policies, interviews with individuals potentially more at risk, such as early career researchers, and case studies of institutional measures. Please visit our website for reports and further information from the project.